What up, TCK Potters? We are back. I am your host, Sky Guasco, joined by my man, Bobby Lamarco. We got another quick hitter for you today, continuing our series on 2021 fantasy football wide receiver busts. Unfortunately, we have to bring up some of our favorite players from last year's draft season, talk about them as busts. They let us down for a number of reasons. We've already gone through a handful of names. If you haven't caught those up, please make sure you double back on the program here and you can catch those. We also released a podcast of about 45 minutes of about 15 different names that we went through. Today, we are putting the spotlight on future Hall of Famer, my man, represented behind me if you're watching on YouTube, the one and only Julio Jones. His mom calls him Quintoris. We call him Julio Jones. Very sad to have Julio at this point of his career. We've been worried about it for a couple years, and now, unfortunately, we are here. The bottom has fallen out seemingly for Julio. Only played 10 games this year. Of course, per usual, Bob's going to give you the 2021 recap, kind of a rundown, and I'm going to look ahead to 2022. But really disappointing. I mean, just on a personal note, this one cuts a little deeper. Like, I've got his jersey right behind me. I'm a huge Julio Jones fan in general, have been for 10 years. Fantasy football legend, Hall of Famer, icon, NFL Hall of Famer, in my opinion. Absolutely dominated fantasy football and the NFL for 10 years. And then injuries finally caught up. And unfortunately, this year, the bottom fell out. We know what happened in Tennessee. Derrick Henry wasn't around for a while. A.J. Brown wasn't around for a while. Ryan Tannehill didn't keep up the efficiency we thought he was going to. The Titans still had the number one seed, but wasn't much to do with Julio Jones coming over from Atlanta. So, Bob, take it away, man. I need a minute to collect my thoughts before I get into my section of Julio Jones, but let's recap 2021 quickly.
It's been an emotional week for us, right? Between Julio, Amari Cooper. I mean, a lot of damage to our souls as guys that we were high on early in the season. Just didn't work out for us, but that's okay. We're here. Me and Sky are very humbled people. We have said, you know what? We're going to find out what we did wrong and we're going to fix it for 2022. That's why you stick with us, folks. So for Julio Jones, you know how we do it. We break this down. For his 2021, his positional ADP was 17, overall 46. So he was going right in that fourth round. He ends up finishing, though, wide receiver 76 in points per game and wide receiver 92 overall. Of course, played 11 games, essentially, including the playoffs overall. So I wanted to take a look at Julio Jones. Was very clear. If you look at his game logs, the guy was in and out of the lineup all year. I mean, he literally played 2-3 games, missed one. Played 2-3 games, missed one. So it was really hard to tell when he was actually healthy. But what you can do is drill down to his snap shares. And for these injured guys, I want to know if they're still productive when they're on the field. I mean, in Julio's case, blended in those 11 games are 5 games essentially that he barely played. And he was not productive in those games when he was hampered. And we've seen this in the past with Julio. He's played through injuries his entire career, but now he's going to be 32 years old. And when we talk about age analysis, age 31 is kind of that time period. 31, 32, 33, and 34. We start seeing players building a trend. And with Julio, unfortunately, the last 2 seasons, even though when he's on the field, he's still showing relatively productive play, unfortunately, in his case, he's not staying on the field. So in the 11 games, including the playoffs that he played this season, his yards per route run was 1.84. His yards per target, 8.2. His targets were about 5 a game, and he only averaged 6.7 points per game. Now, I'm going to give you some comparables for not only Julio in the games he played over 66% of snaps. So in the 6 games where he played 66% of snaps, here's the numbers that they jump up, right? So his yards per route run goes from that 1.84 to 2.18. That was 11th amongst wide receivers this year. So when he's playing on the field at least 2/3 of snaps, he's like a top 12 wide receiver on a yards per route run basis. Yards per target in those 6 games jumps from 8.2 to 9.4. That's 16th amongst wide receivers this season. So he's still performing at a pretty elite level, top 20 in both those metrics. Then you start looking at targets. Here's the biggest thing. In the 6 games where he played 66% of snaps, he only saw 6.5 targets. That's pretty low for Julio. Now, granted, that's an uptick from his 5 that he was seeing in the throughout the whole season combined, but it did result in a pretty big, sizable jump in points per game. He went to 9.4 in the 6 games where he played 66% of snaps. That would have been 39th, top 40 amongst players that played at least 4 games this season. So pretty solid. I mean, when we talk a little bit later about his 2022 outlook and his current ADP, wide receiver 39 is actually a pretty that would be a steal based on his current ADP. But I also want to touch one last thing to it. One of the things bothering Julio for years was his red zone usage. And in the games where he actually played 66% of snaps, we started seeing a pretty solid trend. 5 games where he played those snaps, 8 targets. This is only regular season, so it's only 5 games. Because unfortunately, you can't look at red zone stats in PFF for playoffs, but that's my own gripe. Anyway, 8 red zone targets, 4 receptions, 1 touchdown. In the 5 other games where he didn't reach that 66% threshold, he had 5 targets, 0 receptions, 0 touchdowns. So he's more active in the red zone, clearly. He's more productive in the red zone, clearly, when he was healthy playing those games. So a lot of data to unpack there. So I'm going to kick it over to you, Sky, talk a little bit about his 2022 outlook and your thoughts on his potential for the next season.
Yeah, so you've already broke down a lot of the numbers I was going to cover, so I'll skip over as many of those as I can. I think a big part of Julio's game in general, just kind of a theory thought here when you're breaking down a player like Julio, which we have 12 years of data on. What type of player is Julio outside of the numbers? He's a big play, big threat player, right? We talked about DeAndre Hopkins on the last episode. He is more of a possession receiver with a couple big plays. Julio over his career, 300-yard game a few years ago. He is constantly in the top 1 or 2 in targets, top 1 or 2 in receptions, yardage, big plays. He never got the touchdowns for fantasy football. The problem is the efficiencies are coming down to earth, which is an issue because now he's not hyper targeted. When you don't have huge plays, like say Devontae Adams, not really a huge play guy for the most part, but he gets peppered obviously with targets and no plays like he does with Rodgers in the red zone. So the problem is with me and Julio, the big plays just don't seem to be there anymore. Obviously they have AJ Brown. They have a run game first with King Henry, and Ryan Tannehill is an efficient, quality NFL quarterback, but not necessarily a big play, roll out and chuck it 60 yards like the new NFL. So that's just not the Titans type of football. So my problem is looking ahead, even if Julio's healthy and gives us a full year of Julio, is it going to be the same type of player that we're used to in Atlanta? Age just caught up to him. He's 33 now, right? You and I have done our wide receiver age analysis. 32, 33 is about that year. And I want to give him one more try. If I can get him in the 6th round or whatever it's going to be, that would be great value, but I am a little bit worried about it. So when I look ahead on future kind of projections, I'm looking at air yards, 7 air yards per target. That was 70th in the NFL, right? Unrealized air yards. I know it's a nerd stat, but basically what that means is just, Julio is essentially running routes, trying to get open, whatever, and the ball's not in his area. Just 4.6, 89th in the NFL. The biggest issue here, 1 touchdown, right? The target accuracy from Ryan Tannehill was unbelievable the last 2 years before Julio got there. And whether it's AJ Brown getting hurt, Julio getting hurt, King Henry not, having the box stacked so that he has wide open lanes, whatever it was for the Titans, the efficiency for Ryan Tannehill that we expected over the last couple of years was just not there. The target accuracy to Julio Jones, 6.9, 85th in the NFL. His yards per reception, 14th. That's 29th in the NFL, easily his career low. Yards per target, 9, which you've gone over. Yards per route run, we went over that. Catchable target rate, this is a big concern for me. 68% of his passes from Ryan Tannehill were deemed catchable on 33 targets. That's 90th in the NFL. So again, if we're really crunching numbers here, looking ahead on efficiencies from the offense, efficiency from Julio and Ryan Tannehill moving forward to match up with what you had mentioned, he's still not dominant on the field anymore as well. Target separation, which he used to be absolutely elite at, 1.3 yards of target separation, 102nd in the NFL. The route participation, routes per team pass play that Julio was out there for, 72%. That's 70th in the NFL. So all these metrics, he used to be top 10 and top 5 in most of them. He just isn't anymore. Obviously been injured. Obviously he's hurt. But Bob, you brought it up kind of off screen and as we got started here, the most frustrating part of Julio Jones, like Allen Robinson, is even when he was healthy, you were kind of hesitant to play him after he bombed you for 2 games and he was out and coming back in. And then he's healthy, so you don't play him. Well, he might have a good game. Okay, so you start him the next week, and then he gets injured. and then you bench him again. You're not worried about it, and then he plays again. It's really just a pain in the ass, and it sucks because Julio's my dog, has been forever. Love the guy, but it's been very frustrating to see him finally get hurt last year, miss some time, go to Tennessee, hurt again, and then Henry was down without wide receivers early, then he goes down. So there's no Henry when the wide receivers were healthy at the end. So the Titans just weren't able to play their type of ball. Still somehow had the number 1 seed in the AFC. So there's potential here for next year. But, man, it's going to be hard for me to get back on the Julio train if it's before the 5th round.
So wide receiver outlook for 2022, ADP 163 currently, wide receiver 68. So
sign me up, baby. Sign me up.
Listen, we gotta take a team view for a second. Remember last offseason, one of the things that was appealing about the Titans was the vacated targets, right? They lost Corey Davis, Jonnu Smith, some of their key guys in the receiving game. Well, they didn't replace those guys technically with anybody else other than Julio. So when Julio was not on the field, when you look at the game logs, and listen, we can say what you want about Tannehill. A.J. Brown essentially missed 5 games, 4 full games, and he barely played in the other. That's 5 games. Julio Jones, we just talked about, missed 6 games. They had Nick. So outside of A.J. Brown, the next best receiver, and most targets was Nick Westbrook Akeen. That 57 targets. Then it was Chester Rogers. Anthony Ferkser, I thought, would potentially take over some of that Jonnu Smith role. Instead, it's him and Jeff Swain. So, I understand when they put all their eggs in the basket of Julio, and he ended up getting hurt and playing. He only essentially played 6 full games or 6 relatively healthy games. Tannehill didn't stand a chance. When A.J. Brown's missing 5 games, so. And I didn't even bring up Derrick Henry missing over half the season. So that all those factors go into this. Why Tannehill and this team could be a buy in the second year. Because, listen, I understand that this team does need depth. You can't go into the season with maybe Nick Westbrook-Akeen is actually decent. He is he did perform pretty well. But Chester Rogers, and they need a tight end in there or something. So maybe they go out and do something to protect themselves. However, when you're talking wide receiver 68, you know what? I'll take the shot because there is nobody else. So if Julio stays healthy, it's just him and A.J. Brown. You know what? There's going to be targets to be had. So I think that's another aspect of this too. So overall, I do think that Julio at this price, as long as he stays on this team, they don't make major changes, he might be a buy. So any other thoughts about Julio before we close out?
Yeah, man, I just want to give my player comp. I've been trying to compare-ish. Nobody compares to Julio Jones. And the guy I'm going to comp him to is basically because of age. It's moving to a new team. It's maybe coming to the end of his career, unfortunately. So that's kind of the comparison. But nobody compares to Julio Jones. But I am going to throw a shout out to A.J. Green here, right? So drafted in the same draft class, Alabama, Georgia, both SEC, dominated in college, came out just a few picks apart, Julio Jones and A.J. Green back in the day. Now, A.J. Green really just melted. He dissolved in Cincinnati the last 3 years, right? And he finally goes to Arizona. We talked about this a lot in the DeAndre Hopkins portion of our show last night, but if you missed that, basically A.J. Green had a resurgence because he got more work. He was happy where he was, and DeAndre Hopkins wasn't as dominant as we thought he was going to be. So maybe a comp on somebody who you're going to get in the late rounds, people have forgotten about, who have a great pedigree in fantasy football and might get some more work here, is going to be A.J. Green. Now, Julio Jones only had 2 games over 10 PPR fantasy points. That was unbelievable to me. He's a PPR monster forever, right? Number 1 or 2 with Antonio Brown for 5 years. He had 2 games over 10 total fantasy points in PPR leagues. A.J. Green had 10 games, and 5 of those were over 15 fantasy points. He scored a game every other game until his bye week, and he was consistent. He saw 5+ targets in 8 of his games, 7 targets. He was very consistent, and A.J. Green is going to be somebody that everybody faded last year, probably going to fade again this year, but somebody at the end of their run that we've seen that could be great. Now, don't expect wide receiver 1 or 2 numbers even. But if I get Julio Jones as a consistent wide receiver 3 with wide receiver 1 upside that we know he can have if he catches a touchdown or 2, I think it's a different story. So I'm buying Julio Jones at wide receiver 68. That's a crime. And look, man, if the OG AJ Green's down there in the 70s also, why not? Great wide receiver 5 draft choice with wide receiver 3 upside.
All right, man, that's it, man. This is another episode of How to Avoid Drafting a Bust in Your Fantasy Football Drafts. I'm your host, Bobby LaMarco. That's Sky Gawasco. All our podcasts are a part of the Believe Network, bam, on the fantasy-focused YouTube channel. Shout out and brought to you by BetOnline AG. So once again, Bobby LaMarco, that's Sky Gawasco. We are out of here.